Hello and welcome to These Are the Days of our podcast. I'm Jen.
And I'm Lisa, and today we're celebrating Read a Roadmap Day, which is celebrated on April 5th.
So, Lisa, what are your feelings on roadmaps?
I mean, I don't know if I have strong opinions. Think I just know they exist
Mm,
and use them sometimes,
mm.
especially when I'm navigating the outside world.
That is probably a very balanced reaction to roadmaps, like very functional. I have a much more romanticized view of roadmaps, and I don't really know why that is the case, but I do love maps.
I feel like my family is so into maps, and so we had those books.
Road atlases?
Yeah, and they were the spiral bound book. We literally knew where everything was in Ontario. Everything. I'm just very good at maps and can figure out where I am in space. London definitely puts that to a test because you can't just turn left if you make a mistake because you will end up in the complete wrong
Yeah,
direction.
London is the most baffling and has been challenging my identity as someone who has a relatively good sense of direction because I've lived here for over 5 years. And anytime I'm just like, oh, we'll just take this other route, I end up completely in a different neighborhood. It doesn't make any sense. London is not a grid system and it's very baffling. I don't understand how it
Yeah,
works.
it will trick you. When did the first road map happen?
Well, there is a broad history of maps in general. There's this idea of, us trying to find our place in the world and the ability to, travel from one place to another, crossing time and space. In general, the road map is a type of navigational maps, which, as you might guess, is focused on roads, transit links, and points of interest. It is also considered a type of political map because it often does show political boundaries between counties, states, regions, or countries. The earliest known road map is the Turin Papyrus map, which was drawn in 1160 BC. This depicts routes along dry riverbeds in the mining regions of our favorite region, ancient Egypt.
That's our favorite one.
Yay! They had road maps on lock thousands of years ago. There are a bunch of other super old road maps. So there's one called the Dura Europa road map, which is showing the first road map of Europe. And it was drawn on the leather portion of a Roman soldier's shield in about 235 AD. And it showed towns along the Black Sea. And then, the saying, all roads lead to Rome. There is a map from the 1500s that was made by Erhard Etzlab, who produced the Way to Rome, and it was made for pilgrims in medieval Central Europe to do the pilgrimage in the holy year 1500. Anyone who has more recently road tripped, especially in North America, has probably seen a slightly ripped, dusty, improperly folded map produced by either AAA, which is the American Automobile Association, or its Canadian counterpart, CAA. AAA started producing road maps in 1905. The first one was drawn on linen, which sounds very fancy.
Oh, that is lovely.
Yeah. Yeah, I want some linen road maps. That sounds great. And then Rand McNally, who's another big name in the map game, produced their first maps in 1904.
I read that they were on these like large cards and they would mark the roads in red for the good roads. That would have been a really cool job to be like, I just need to adventure to where people want to go and find which roads are good.
I kind of did that in a very small scale in one of my many jobs in my life, where I was working for this active transportation consortium, and we got together in groups of people that were really familiar with the cycling route of a region in Ontario, and we would meet and we would discuss which would be the best way to get from 3 different points and produced a map for cycling route. It just meant I got to sit down with other cycling geeks and be like, oh, that road sucks and this road is really good. And it was a very nerdy and very fun blip in my career trajectory.
Nice. I guess we move from road maps to GPS.
So changing the medium from just a standard paper road map to an electronic road map?
Yeah, if you went from road maps to GPS, then to Google Maps. GPS is a type of global navigation satellite system, and GPS is the one specifically owned by the US government. And it was started by the Department of Defense in 1973. I mean, I knew it was accurate. I get it, but I didn't realize how accurate, but it's within like 2 centimeters of your location. 2 centimeters. It needs four GPS satellites with an unobstructed line to them to coordinate your location. Then I got down a rabbit hole into satellites. So how many GPS satellites do you think there are?
20,000.
I thought there would be a lot of satellites. There's only 29 GPS satellites in orbit.
What?
These 29, there's actually 2 reserve ones.
It doesn't seem like enough.
So like I said, GPS is the American version. There's like a Chinese, Russian, Indian, there's other British, there's other global navigation systems out there. Orbital radius of one satellite is 26,000 kilometers. With these 29, you would actually get the full coverage of the Earth. Apparently, it started because so when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, 2 American physicists started monitoring the satellite's transmissions, and that they soon realized that they could identify the satellite in its orbit using the Doppler effect, which is a concept in physics that the transmission of waves, whether they're radio or whatever, goes out at the same equal frequency.
I love hearing you describe physics to me. That's like
Thanks.
we are the physics experts. You should definitely come to us for more physics facts.
Definitely. Don't question anything I just said because I don't get it. Basically, the Doppler effect is the principle used in GPS, but because it was by the Department of Defense, it was completely private for the US government until a Korean air flight accidentally flew into the wrong airspace, aka the Soviet Union, and it was shot down. Like 270 people died.
Ooh,
So,
that's not
yeah,
good.
kind of bad. So, Ronald Reagan let free access to GPS, but it wasn't until May 1st, 2000 that the public could start building upon the technology of GPS. So now, because it's almost like crowdsourced, of obviously by private company, it's like crazy accurate and more accurate than the military's use of it. I guess something horrible had to happen for us to be able to use it. I do actually remember my dad as a gift in 2000 got a GPS computer tracker for his outdoor adventures, and it was like such a big deal. It was like a very expensive gift from his company, and it was like the coolest thing that we could be in the middle of nowhere camping and know exactly where we were in like time and space. Not time. I don't understand time.
I remember that transition as well because as millennials, we really straddled this point between like all of the family arguments in the car over road maps to having that little separate device in your car that you would plug in to get directions turn by turn. And also, did you ever have that period of time where you printed out MapQuest directions?
Yeah.
That was a special time in our lives as well. That would have been like when I started driving and I'd like print out the turn by
Which
turns.
is interesting because that goes into the Google Maps, MapQuest, all these companies that started online. So Google Maps wasn't actually the first inventor of the directional wayfinding maps, but it is now the most popular. In 2020, so last year, it had over 1 billion monthly users. 1 billion. So 1/7 of the world's population uses Google Maps on a monthly basis, and it is the world's most popular smartphone app with over 54% of smartphone owners using Google Maps.
Fun fact, it's, my cousin Andrea's favorite app. She will say that to anyone who asks. Her favorite app is Google Maps. She just likes, seeing where she is in the world.
I mean, they do have, like, really cool features besides, like, the wayfinding. So, like, not only can you walk, bike, or get public transportation or car directions, but it has, like, Google Earth or Google Street View. So it has, like, some really cool stuff, I'd say. Like, they've really advanced it.
I think that our reliance on Google Maps becomes really clear in the hilarious news stories of people just blindly trusting Google Maps at the expense of like any sort of logic. So I think it was actually just a few months ago that there was a news story of Sabine Moreau who left her hometown in Belgium to pick up her friend at the train station, which was only like 90 miles away. And she drove 900 miles to Croatia,
What?
taking several days before she realized that she had gone wrong. This is a thing that happened. She just put it into her thing and was like, "Oh, weird. It's so weird because the signs started changing language and it
Oh
took over
my
2 days to
god.
get there."
That is literally the episode of The Office where Michael turns right into the lake because his GPS is telling him to go to make a right-hand turn, and Dwight's like, "No, veer right, don't turn right," and then he sinks his car.
And there's another guy who had to get his truck airlifted off of a mountain because he just followed the Google Maps instructions up basically a goat path on the mountain, and he got wedged in on a cliffside and had to get a helicopter to rescue him in his van.
Oh my god, that is so silly.
One of the things that I was seeing about the future of Google Maps is the idea of incorporating augmented reality as part of it, which I think we've kind of already seen with Pokemon Go and other apps like that, where it's like they can add additional things to your map experience, which I think is kind of cool.
I mean, I liked Pokemon Go when I played it for, like, a hot minute,
Yeah.
so I thought it
Yeah.
was good.
So I wanted to veer into what I would say is like the slightly darker side of road maps. So I would think that most people are familiar with some of the problematic cultural biases of maps in general when we talk about different projections that exaggerate like northern and western countries at the expense of the global south. But there actually is also a political side to the simple roadmap. Steinbeck once remarked, "Maps are not reality at all, they can be tyrants." And there's an argument saying that roadmaps can be used and were designed to advance capitalism because they shaped where and how people traveled. The maps that you would pick up at gas stations were often provided by oil and gas companies. Esso and Shell mass produced road maps in North America. These were often distributed for free at gas stations, and they would add onto the maps their branding as well as the gas stations for their own brand.
Right.
So the cost of producing these maps was also offset by advertisements, which would determine which notable sites would appear because motorists are more likely to stop, eat, stay, explore destinations that were actually noted on the map than those that didn't. Beyond promoting just a specific brand, maps were designed to promote auto travel in general. So, if you think they were starting to become really popular in the early 1900s, the road trip started to become this ubiquitous adventure, and that would benefit, obviously, oil and gas companies and car manufacturers to encourage this idealized places to visit and the idea of freedom, adventure, the great outdoors. I think just in general, it's important to note that all maps involve choices because maps need to simplify the world that we live in order to be useful. They need to make a decision about what real world things to represent on the map and which ones to exclude. And all of these choices can shape the way that we experience the world. So, as you were saying, the bright, thick lines on the map are chosen to be the fast routes, and people are more likely to take them. So we grew up with the Ontario Road Map, and there's one that's produced by the provincial government, and it usually highlights the provincial highways. But sometimes local roads actually have very similar surfaces and similar speed limits and would actually be a similar route time. But people will avoid them because the highlighted route on the map, whereas other maps that are produced by local areas would highlight their local routes, which would bring you through downtown areas to promote the businesses there. So I thought that was quite interesting to think about how just these small decisions on roadmaps, which we feel like,
Mm.
how can these be political? How can these are just like these are the roads, but there's actually so many choices that go into the creation of maps that it ends up really changing our reality. And then that didn't stop with paper maps because obviously Google is based on algorithms that are a critical point of promoting different businesses now. So being able to show up if you're in an area and you want to Google a coffee shop, whoever shows up at the top of the list, that's good. There are millions of decisions that underlie how that happens in the algorithms.
Oh, for this, yeah, this makes so much sense. And it's like when I was reading about AAA and how they first got those large cards to tell people which way to drive, they interviewed a man whose job it was to do that. And they're like, "Oh, you're the first GPS." But a good point, he was like, he was the first Yelp, he was the first TripAdvisor because he could go literally to anywhere and of course list out the amenities, but be like, "Oh, no, I like this place better." And it's just his personal opinion on his favorite stops or what he deems of interest en route to like New York City to Niagara Falls. That was a really big trip people would do, and choosing which places people could stop at through whatever lens he had determined who got business and not. And I think that still carries through to Google Maps, whereas you can advertise on Google Maps only so that even when you're searching an area, even if you weren't looking for that thing specifically, your business name comes up and is prominent. Just like everything in life, apparently, there's a lot of bias. And it's not just so simple as getting from A to B. There's everything's through a different lens, a gaze, if you will.
Absolutely. And it really is the tool of persuasion more than an accurate representation of the world.
It's interesting.
We already mentioned that both of us think that we're quite good at math, but I feel like there is big splits in the population about who thinks they're good at directions and some stereotypes around navigational skills.
I think there is that stereotype of men versus women. Men are better at reading maps. I will say in everything that I read that there was no definitive proof that is true at all. I mean, there was some studies that looked at men's and women's performance in navigational skills in relation to evolution and if there's an evolutionary story to explain a slight gender difference, because it's actually less so about who's better at it, but the way in which we navigate in our minds. So men navigate in two-dimensional maps in their heads, while women navigate by routes and landmarks. And so it's the idea that back in hunter gatherers days, it was always the men who hunted and the women who gathered, and men had to chase game across open spaces so they have a good sense of the lay of the land, and then their brains evolve to navigate in this mental map idea where women are gatherers, so they collected fruits and vegetables, and since plants remained in this same location, their brains evolved to navigate by key landmarks.
Which is reasonable idea, but like the thing with any evolutionary hypotheses, it's all hypothesis generating. There's no way that we can actually test these hypotheses. So it's like, well, this might be true. This is logical and sensible, but whether or not that is actually accurate is very questionable. There have been some suggestive studies that have shown slight differences in the way that women and men navigate, as you were talking about, like possibly using cardinal directions versus using these landmarks. And then that might translate into one group performing better at a certain type of test than another. So then that will become splashy in the news and say, oh, well, this proves it, but it's actually just because it's testing one type of wayfinding ability, not necessarily definitively saying, like, one group is better than the other.
Like I said, like there's no studies that prove there was any significant gender difference in their performance of navigational skills. So I'm going to call BS on it. But what I did think was interesting, and I had heard of this before, was that it goes back to like a nature versus nurture thing. And I think, like I mentioned, my family is very good at maps, maybe because we spent our family holidays camping in very remote places, that we were really good at maps and navigating the world that way. So I'd say it's more nurture. And I think this example of this Aboriginal tribe in North Queensland, Australia, called, oh no, there's a there's so many double letters. And how do you pronounce a W? Not like a W, but two
Oh, good.
U's. So we're gonna say
Oh no.
goo goo, goo goo. Yermither, double R. So that tribe, they use the spatial information as directions. Okay, so English speakers and others are geocentric. So when we come to orientating ourselves in the world, objects are like left, right, in front of you, to the back of you. The way they orientate themselves is by actual direction. So like if I was to ask you to move to the left, they would tell you no matter where you are to move north, east, south, or west. So they have a complete understanding of where they are in the world by the direction that they're facing. So there would be no left. It would be everything is either west, east, north, or south, which is super interesting. So these young kids, they don't get lost. They're just completely can find their space in the world, which again, I think is back to this nurture debate. So it's not like a gendered thing, or maybe it is a gendered thing, but that's only because you're not teaching young girls to learn how to use maps.
That is evidence to show that this is very much a cultural bias, that we believe that men are better at directions and wayfinding, and so therefore we're socially programming there to be a gender difference. Going back to the question of nature versus nurture, there is some nature.
There is some nature. You are correct. Like very recently, 3 people won the Nobel Prize in Medicine studying grid cells, which is literally the navigational area of your brain, and how some people just are really good at navigating, and it relates to our spatial abilities. So it's located in or near the hippocampus, which regulates memory. Grid cells that are related to the way that you, again, orient yourself in space are related to memory, which is so weird. And I was like, how can someone have or be really good at reading maps and but then have really poor memory? That's an interesting one.
I did find a really rare neurological condition though.
Ooh.
There are people that have developmental topographical disorientation. These are people that have absolutely no sense of direction at all. So they're completely unable to hold maps and directions in their mind, to the extent that they will regularly get lost in their own homes because they're not able to create a cognitive mental map of their environment.
What? That is so nuts. So apparently there are the different types of grid cells, in which there's like the self-location one, then there's root memory, and then there's map rotation, which actually sounds, I think, the most difficult, to be able to mentally rotate a map and know the turns without physically having to turn the map around.
If you think of any IQ test or like SAT type tests, there's always those questions that you have to mentally rotate a problem. That's a really classic example of testing navigational abilities. Going back to the brain though, I also found this really cool study where they compared London cab drivers. In order to get your black cab license in London, you actually need to memorize all 25,000 streets in London, which is a notoriously difficult license to get. And so this study compared people that signed up for this training course and did some brain imaging studies to look at the volume of gray matter in that posterior hippocampus area. And they found that the brains looked the same at the beginning of the course, but those who successfully completed the training course and were actually licensed ended up having an increase in volume of gray matter after completing this course, which suggests that just by practicing these skills as well, you can actually rewire and increase your spatial reasoning.
So maybe read more maps if you want more gray matter?
Yeah, it seems like it's a skill that can be learned, and that might be, as you were saying, the one of the explanations for any gender differences is if we are teaching different groups to be better at maps. Did you come across anything around spatial anxiety? Because I found this really
I did,
interesting.
I did, and then I thought this is so ridiculous. Who would have anxiety about spatial things? And then I thought, oh, Jen would. I'll let Jen talk about this.
Well, I actually think this is a really valid idea. And this is that you will have spatial anxiety about getting into unfamiliar situations. And they found that performance on wayfinding is actually negatively impacted by spatial anxiety. And they did find a really gendered pattern in this, that spatial anxiety is a lot higher in women who tend to have a higher concern for their personal safety. And that's because the consequences for venturing into unfamiliar environments tends to be higher for women. So women can be found to restrict their movements due to spatial anxiety and also depend more heavily on like just being glued to your Google Maps to make sure that you don't find yourself in a situation that's unfamiliar and therefore at risk. So in this way, I actually feel like your ability to read maps and your comfort in finding your way in the world might actually be a bit of a social justice issue as well.
It is really interesting, and I will say I actually have had spatial anxiety, both me and Andrew, because when we took a wrong turn and accidentally went into a favela in Rio, which is,
Not a place you're supposed to just wander as a tourist.
yeah, that will cause a ton of anxiety and intense fear no matter no matter your gender. Okay, I'll take it
Absolutely.
back. Not only you have spatial anxiety.
There are some people that have higher spatial anxiety that even in a familiar place, they'll check a map or they'll check their phone, even if it's a place that, you know, you could probably find your way home in. And that is an indicator that you have higher spatial anxiety. Whereas I feel like you're sometimes a homing pigeon. I just remember one of our misspent youth moments where you're just like, little Lisa drunkenly ambling in a like foreign city and just like how do we get back to where we need to go, and you just like literally like eyes closed and you just point. It's like this is where we need to go.
That is like one of Tori's favorite stories is like the amount of times I've got us back to where we need to go, not acting like a sober person.
I also want to claim half of this navigational crown because when I concussed myself in Venice, the two people that I was with that were trying to get us back to our accommodations were just like, "Where are we going?" I was like, "Guys, it's just over there." I'm like concussed and suffering. And I was like, "Don't you understand? We just need to go this way." And they're like, "But how do you know this?" I was like, "I know." Just
I just
I just
know.
know.
Good thing you didn't concuss your hippocampus.
Yeah,
Excellent
apparently
work.
not. So that's good. I would like to argue for the romance of the roadmap. Hear me out.
Okay. Do you find romance literally in everything?
Yes, absolutely.
How do you feel about your man leaving Bridgerton? Is that devastating news to you?
Oh, absolutely. I do think there will be a crisis of thirst in the nations because of this. It just is not okay.
What if he was holding a roadmap?
Lisa,
Would it be
Lisa,
too much for
you know
you?
how I feel about like geographers.
Oh my god. Okay, why are roadmaps romantic?
Roadmaps really walk that line being eminently practical and useful, but also using beautiful visual imagery. Maps can be really beautiful. Maps can like convey emotion the way that like colors and
Yeah,
graphics.
but roadmaps.
So there are a few key examples. There is a line in a song by Hawksley Workman that I love. It says, "The glove box light shines bright enough to see. You read the map like you're reading poetry."
The glove box light shines bright enough to see. You read the map like you were reading poetry.
It's super romantic. Also, I think that there is this like wonderful tangible thing about preserving the spirit of a journey and an adventure that when you go back to the stack of old road maps in your glove box, it's almost as this record of the adventures that you've been on. And my sister and I did a really fun example of this. We had a physical map of the UK for our Land's End John O'Groats, which took us to the southernmost tip of England to the northernmost tip of Scotland. And along our way, we drew our route. And then each day we would mark a few things down. So when I open this map now, it has all of these moments of the trip and just brings me back to very specific things that were a big deal then, but that you don't remember now. So it really captures the adventure in this really interesting way. For example, we marked the day that we camped in ants, just an ant night, or the day that we found really delicious pie.
So I'd say it's less that they're romantic in and of themselves. They're like a tool of romance.
Yeah, and it encouraged us to engage more with our surroundings and help us to pay attention to what's going on around us. So I think that on this Read a Roadmap Day, you should just unfold a paper roadmap and take a nostalgic trip down memory lane, particularly now as we can hardly leave our houses. I think pulling out your maps and dreaming of past and future adventures might be a way to spend the day.
Beautiful. Some famous birthdays. Spencer Tracy, he was an actor. Golden age of Hollywood, you know? And then I don't actually know a lot of the other people born on this day, but there were some good or not so good things that happened on April 5th. We have the Mayflower set sail for Massachusetts from England. George Washington exercised his authority to veto a bill, which is the first time a president has ever vetoed anything. Chile declares a war in Bolivia and Peru, starting the War of the Pacific, in which Bolivia is still petitioning the UN to get a section of land back so they can access the Pacific, which would be very useful for them as one of the poorest countries in the world. The April 5th movement in China leads to the incident in Tiananmen Square. In 1969, April 5th, the first anti-Vietnam War demonstrations happen across the US. So a lot of historical events.
There are a few other things to celebrate on April 5th as well, if you're not completely convinced by the lure of a roadmap. You could choose to celebrate your flash drives, as it is also National Flash Drive Day. So party real hard about that one. There is also Deep Dish Pizza Day. So if you want to clog your arteries and just like have a brick of solid cheese in your digestive tract for the next 8 days, definitely celebrate.
Oh, I'm so into that. I'm so
Well, they
into
you could
that.
combine this as Go for Broke Day, and that is the day to just put it all on the line, take a chance, jump in. So today is the day to tell that person you like them or initiate on a risky project. So today's not the day to play it safe. Today is the day to jump on in with both feet, go for broke, take out that roadmap and have an adventure, muster up that courage. I think that's all that we have to say on maps, specifically road maps.
I think so.
But we do want to remind you to
rate, review, and subscribe.
These Are the Days of Our Podcast. Talk to you soon.
Okay, bye.
These are